There's a warship at the bottom of the Pacific that died like almost nothing else ever has, broken in half but still fighting, her two separate pieces blazing away at the enemy until the very end. This is the story of Fusō, Japan's first homegrown battleship and their most expensive mistake. A ship so fundamentally flawed that she spent 30 years being fixed, only to meet her end in the last great battleship battle in history. She was supposed to be Japan's declaration of naval independence. Instead, she became a floating lesson in why ambition and engineering don't always get along. Chapter 1. The Dream. In 1910, Japan had a problem. They'd just finished beating the hell out of Russia in a war that shocked the world, but they'd done it using battleships built by the British. For a nation trying to establish itself as a major power, that was like winning the Olympics while wearing someone else's jersey. The Japanese Navy looked at their foreign-built ships and decided it was time to build their own. Not just any battleship, they wanted something that would announce to the world that Japan could play in the big leagues of naval construction. What they came up with was Fusō, and she was going to be magnificent. On paper, anyway. The design brief read like a naval architect's fever dream. More guns than anyone had ever put on a battleship, armor thick enough to stop anything the enemy could throw, and speed to keep up with the fastest ships in the fleet. They wanted a ship that could outfight, outrun, and outlast anything on the ocean. The problem with fever dreams is that they don't always translate well to reality. Fusō's designers packed 12 14-inch guns into 6 twin turrets, which sounds impressive until you realize they had to spread them along the hull like railroad cars. The result was a ship that looked less like a warship and more like someone had lined up gun turrets on a football field and decided to call it a battleship. The superstructure they mounted amidships became legendary, and not in a good way. It was a towering pagoda of platforms, bridges, and fire control stations that looked like someone had started building a skyscraper and forgotten to stop. British naval observers called it magnificent. Everyone else called it a target. But this was 1910, and Japan was thinking big. They were going to build a battleship that would make the Royal Navy nervous and the German Navy jealous. A ship that would prove Japanese engineering could compete with anyone in the world. Construction began with the kind of optimism that only comes from having never built anything like this before. The Kure Naval Arsenal threw itself into the project with enthusiasm that would have been inspiring if they'd had any idea what they were getting themselves into. The early construction photos show a hull that looks normal enough, until you start counting gun turrets and realize there are way too many of them. The ship was already developing her distinctive profile, with that forest of gun barrels and the beginnings of what would become the most complicated superstructure in naval history. Japanese steel was forming into shapes that had only existed in the imaginations of designers who'd been given unlimited budgets and told to create something unprecedented. The hull grew longer to accommodate all those turrets. The superstructure grew taller to house all the fire control equipment. The whole ship grew more complex by the day. By 1912, Fusō was beginning to look like herself, which is to say, like nothing else that had ever floated. She was unique, ambitious, and already showing signs of the problems that would plague her for the rest of her career. But she was also undeniably impressive. More than 600 feet long, displacing over 30,000 tons, and armed with enough firepower to level a small city. When she was finally completed in 1915, she was the most heavily armed battleship in the world. The launching ceremony was everything Japan had hoped for. Flags, speeches, and the satisfaction of watching their first homegrown battleship slide into the water. She represented everything the Japanese Navy wanted to be: modern, powerful, and completely independent of foreign shipbuilders. What nobody mentioned during the speeches was that she was also fundamentally flawed in ways that wouldn't become fully apparent until they tried to use her as an actual warship. But that would come later. For now, Fusō was Japan's triumph, their proof that they belonged among the world's great naval powers. She was beautiful, she was powerful, and she was entirely their own. The fact that she was also a floating disaster waiting to happen wasn't really obvious yet. Chapter 2. Reality Bites. The first time Fusō fired all her guns at once, she discovered something her designers hadn't fully thought through. When you put 6 turrets on a single hull, the ones in the middle tend to interfere with the ones at the ends. It's called blast interference, and it's exactly as problematic as it sounds. Picture this: you've got 12 massive naval guns, each capable of hurling a 1,400-pound shell over 10 miles. When turret 3 fires, the muzzle blast from those guns interferes with the fire control systems for turrets 2 and 4. When multiple turrets fire simultaneously, which is kind of the whole point of having multiple turrets, the blast effects turn coordinated gunnery into a chaotic mess. The gunnery trials revealed that Fusō's theoretical firepower advantage was largely theoretical. Yes, she could fire more shells than most battleships. No, she couldn't fire them accurately when using more than a few turrets at once. It was like having a sports car with 12 engines, except half of them interfered with the other half whenever you tried to use them simultaneously. But blast interference was just the beginning of Fusō's problems. That magnificent pagoda superstructure that looked so impressive in photographs? It turned out to be a masterpiece of weight distribution problems and structural instability. The Japanese Navy had built their superstructure tall because they wanted their fire control stations high above the ship for maximum visibility. Unfortunately, they'd made it so tall and heavy that it affected the ship's stability. Fusō had a tendency to roll in ways that made accurate gunnery even more difficult and made her crew seasick in weather that wouldn't bother a fishing boat. Then there were the mechanical problems. 12 guns meant 12 sets of turret machinery, 12 sets of ammunition hoists, and 12 sets of things that could break down at inconvenient times. Fusō's mechanical complexity made her a maintenance nightmare for crews who were still learning how to operate a battleship this advanced. The armor scheme, impressive on paper, created its own problems in practice. The designers had tried to protect everything, which meant the armor was spread thin in some areas and created awkward transitions that could channel shell hits into vulnerable spots. It was like wearing a suit of armor designed by someone who'd never seen a sword. Early sea trials revealed that Fusō's top speed was somewhat theoretical. Yes, she could make the numbers her designers had promised, but only under perfect conditions, with a clean bottom, calm seas, and everything working exactly as intended. In actual service conditions, she was slower than advertised and burned more fuel than expected. The crew quarters were another adventure in optimistic design. The designers had packed so much equipment and ammunition storage into the hull that the sailors were left with spaces that would make a submarine crew complain. Living conditions aboard Fusō were cramped even by the standards of 1915 battleships. Navigation was its own special challenge. Fusō's unique profile and weight distribution gave her handling characteristics that were unlike any other ship in the Japanese Navy. She turned like a freight train, accelerated like a loaded cargo ship, and responded to helm commands with the enthusiasm of a reluctant mule. By 1917, the Japanese Navy had to face an uncomfortable truth. Their first homegrown battleship was a magnificent achievement that didn't actually work very well as a warship. She was too complex for reliable operation, too unwieldy for effective maneuvering, and too problematic for the kind of combat effectiveness that battleships were supposed to provide. Fusō was a ship that looked impressive in port and created headaches at sea. But she was their ship, and they were stuck with her. The Japanese Navy had invested too much money, time, and national pride in Fusō to admit she was a mistake. Instead, they decided to fix her. This turned out to be much easier said than done. The problems weren't simple design flaws that could be corrected with minor modifications. They were fundamental issues built into the ship's basic architecture. Fixing them would require essentially rebuilding the ship from the waterline up. But hey, they built her once. How hard could it be to build her again? Chapter 3. The First Fix. By 1930, the Japanese Navy had reached the conclusion that Fusō needed more than routine maintenance. She needed what polite naval terminology calls extensive modernization and what everyone else calls ripping the guts out of a ship and starting over. The problem was figuring out where to start. Fusō had so many interconnected issues that fixing one problem often made 3 others worse. It was like trying to repair a house where the foundation, walls, and roof all had structural problems that depended on each other. The Japanese decided to tackle the most obvious problems first, which meant essentially scrapping the entire superstructure and building a new one. The famous pagoda that had made Fusō instantly recognizable was cut away like a tumor, leaving a hull that looked oddly naked without its towering forest of platforms and bridges. What they built to replace it was better, but not exactly what you'd call elegant. The new superstructure was shorter, sturdier, and more practical, but it still looked like something designed by a committee that couldn't agree on what they wanted. The armor scheme got a complete overhaul. The original protection had been spread too thin across too many areas, so the naval architects concentrated the armor where it would do the most good. This made Fusō better protected in theory, but it also made her heavier and slower in practice. Her machinery received what can charitably be called aggressive upgrades: new boilers, improved engines, and updated power systems that were supposed to give her better speed and reliability. The machinery spaces were gutted and rebuilt with equipment that promised to solve her performance problems. The crew quarters got attention too, mostly because the original accommodations had been so terrible that even the notoriously Spartan Japanese Navy couldn't ignore the complaints. The sailors got slightly larger spaces and marginally better living conditions, which was progress of a sort. But the fundamental problems remained untouched because they were unfixable. You can't redesign a ship's basic architecture after it's already been built. Fusō's hull proportions, her turret arrangement, and her structural weight distribution were permanent features that no amount of modernization could change. The gunnery problems that had plagued her since 1915 were still there after the reconstruction. 12 guns and 6 turrets still created blast interference. The fire control systems were better, but they were still trying to coordinate more weapons than could be effectively used simultaneously. The reconstruction took 3 years and cost almost as much as building a new battleship would have. When Fusō emerged from the shipyard in 1933, she looked different and performed better, but she was still fundamentally the same problematic ship she'd always been. The Japanese Navy now had a modernized battleship that was more reliable, better protected, and marginally more effective than the original. They also had a ship that was still too slow, still too complex, and still hampered by design decisions that had been made 20 years earlier. But Fusō looked impressive again, and that counted for something. When foreign naval attachés visited Japanese ports, they saw a battleship that appeared to be thoroughly modern and potentially dangerous. The fact that appearances can be deceiving wasn't necessarily something you wanted to advertise. The crew appreciated the improvements, especially the better living conditions and more reliable machinery. Serving aboard Fusō was no longer quite the endurance test it had been during the 1920s. The ship was more comfortable, more predictable, and less likely to break down at embarrassing moments. Unfortunately, the wider naval world hadn't been standing still while Japan rebuilt their problem child. Other navies had been building new battleships with lessons learned from the Great War, incorporating technologies and design philosophies that made even the modernized Fusō look outdated. By 1935, Fusō was a thoroughly rebuilt ship in a world that had moved beyond what she could offer. She was better than she'd ever been, but better than terrible isn't the same as actually good. The Japanese Navy looked at their expensive, rebuilt, still problematic battleship and made a decision that would define the next phase of Fusō's career. If she couldn't be the ship they'd originally wanted, maybe she could be something else entirely. Time for another reconstruction. Chapter 4. The Second Guess. The Japanese Navy had blown 5 years and a fortune trying to polish a turd, and by 1938 they were ready to try again, because apparently the first complete reconstruction hadn't been expensive or time-consuming enough. This time, they were going to fix everything. Not just the obvious problems, but the fundamental issues that had been built into Fusō's DNA since 1915. They were going to create a thoroughly modern battleship from the bones of their original mistake. What followed was less a modernization and more a controlled demolition followed by an entirely new construction project. The shipyard workers didn't just modify Fusō, they disassembled her down to the hull and rebuilt her as a completely different ship. The superstructure got its third complete redesign in 25 years. This time, the architects went for a more streamlined approach that looked almost modern compared to the original pagoda nightmare. The new design was lower, more integrated, and actually looked like it belonged on the same ship as the hull. Modern fire control systems needed radar. Radar needed to be up high. Fusō's superstructure was already a nightmare. The new fire control installations tried to balance effectiveness with the reality of a ship that had never been designed for electronic warfare systems. The anti-aircraft armament got a complete overhaul because the world had discovered that aircraft were becoming a serious threat to surface ships. Fusō sprouted dozens of smaller guns intended to shoot down planes, which made her look like a battleship that had been attacked by a swarm of gun mounts. Her armor protection was revised again, this time with lessons learned from actual combat experience. The new scheme was more rational than the original and more effective than the first reconstruction, but it still had to work with hull lines that had been designed for different priorities. The machinery spaces were gutted and rebuilt with more modern equipment that promised better speed, improved reliability, and reduced fuel consumption. The engineers installed new boilers, updated turbines, and electrical systems that belonged in the same decade as the ship that carried them. Even the crew quarters got another upgrade, because apparently the improvements from the first reconstruction hadn't been enough. The sailors got better accommodations, improved amenities, and living spaces that were almost comfortable by the standards of 1930s battleships. When Fusō emerged from her second reconstruction in 1941, she looked like a completely different ship than the one that had been launched in 1915. She was faster, better protected, more heavily armed, and equipped with modern fire control systems that actually worked. She was also still hampered by design decisions that had been made 3 decades earlier. The basic hull proportions were the same. The turret arrangement was unchanged. The fundamental compromises built into her original design were still there, hidden under layers of improvements and modifications. But she was undeniably more effective than she'd ever been. The gunnery problems weren't solved, but they were reduced. The stability issues weren't eliminated, but they were manageable. The mechanical reliability wasn't perfect, but it was good enough for practical service. The Japanese Navy finally had a version of Fusō that could serve as a frontline battleship without embarrassing anyone. She wasn't the ship they'd originally envisioned, and she wasn't as good as the newer battleships other countries were building, but she was competent enough to earn her place in the battle line. Just in time for a war that would prove battleships weren't the future of naval combat anyway. The timing was almost poetic. After 26 years of trying to make Fusō into an effective battleship, the Japanese had finally succeeded, just as the world was discovering that carriers and aircraft were about to make battleships obsolete. Fusō was ready for the kind of war the Japanese Navy had been preparing for since 1905. Unfortunately, that wasn't the kind of war they were about to fight. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. For now, in 1941, the Japanese Navy had a thoroughly modernized Fusō that looked impressive, performed adequately, and represented everything they'd learned about battleship design over the previous 3 decades. She was their most expensive learning experience, their most rebuilt ship, and their best example of what happened when national pride met engineering reality and nobody wanted to admit they'd made a mistake. Ready to find out how much all that reconstruction was actually worth? Chapter 5. The War Begins. Distant Thunder. December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor, the day that changed everything, launched 1,000 movies, and officially introduced the world to the concept that battleships might not be the kings of naval warfare anymore. For most of the Imperial Japanese Navy, this was their moment of glory, the carefully planned surprise attack that would cripple American naval power in the Pacific. For Fusō, it was the naval equivalent of being assigned to hold everyone's coats while they went to the big dance. While Nagumo's carriers were launching the planes that would make history, Fusō was steaming around in distant support, far enough from the action that her crew could barely see the smoke on the horizon. It was like being invited to the party of the century and then being asked to wait in the parking lot. The irony was thick enough to cut with a knife. Japan's first homegrown battleship, the ship that was supposed to represent their naval independence and power, was relegated to backup duty while carrier-based aircraft did the heavy lifting. After nearly 3 decades of service, 2 major modernizations, and countless training exercises, Fusō's big moment in the spotlight was watching other people fight. Picture the crew's reaction. They'd spent years preparing for exactly this kind of operation, mastering their complex gunnery systems and learning to operate the most distinctive battleship in the Pacific. Their ship was loaded with ammunition, their guns were trained to perfection, and their battle stations were manned by sailors who knew every bolt and rivet of their unique vessel. And they were positioned so far from the actual fighting that they might as well have been back in port reading about it in newspapers. The distant support role wasn't accidental. The Japanese naval staff knew exactly what they were doing when they kept their older battleships away from the primary action. Modern naval warfare was being redefined in real time, and carrier aviation was proving that the age of the battleship might be coming to an end faster than anyone had expected. But try explaining that to a crew that had dedicated their careers to operating what was supposed to be the ultimate expression of naval power. Fusō's sailors could see the smoke rising from Pearl Harbor, hear the distant rumble of explosions, and know that history was being made without them. It was like being a professional musician and being asked to sit in the audience during the concert of the decade. The early war operations that followed Pearl Harbor established a pattern that would define Fusō's entire wartime experience: always important enough to be included, never important enough to be essential. She was assigned to support missions, convoy escort duties, and rear area patrol operations that kept her busy but never quite got her into the kind of surface action she'd been designed for. It was like owning a race car and using it exclusively for grocery runs. The crew adapted to their secondary role with the professional resignation of people who understood that complaining wouldn't change their orders. They mastered convoy escort procedures, learned to coordinate with destroyer squadrons, and became experts at the kind of routine patrol work that made their advanced gunnery training feel increasingly irrelevant. Month after month, Fusō steamed through Pacific waters that were increasingly dominated by carriers, submarines, and aircraft. The kind of surface engagements that battleships had been built for were becoming rarer as both sides learned that air power could reach further and strike harder than even the biggest naval guns. By mid-1942, the crew could sense that the war was moving in directions that didn't include them. American submarines were turning Japanese shipping lanes into hunting grounds. Carrier battles were deciding the fate of entire island chains. And battleships like Fusō were being relegated to the role of expensive insurance policies against threats that might never materialize. But they kept doing their job, because that's what professional naval crews do. They maintained their ship, practiced their gunnery, and waited for orders that would finally give them a chance to prove what 3 decades of development and 2 major reconstructions had actually accomplished. The waiting was about to get much longer. Chapter 6. The Long Middle Watch. If the early war years were frustrating for Fusō's crew, the middle war years were like being trapped in the world's most expensive, most dangerous, and most boring office job. The kind where your specific skills are technically valuable, but somehow never quite what anyone needs right now. By mid-1943, the war had settled into a rhythm that nobody had anticipated and everyone was learning to hate. Gone were the heady days of easy victories and dramatic fleet actions. What remained was the grinding, exhausting business of trying to maintain supply lines across thousands of miles of ocean, while American submarines picked off Japanese ships like a sniper working through a phone book. Fusō's War became a series of escort missions that read like the world's most dangerous shipping manifest. Transport Division A needs protection getting from point B to point C. Try not to get torpedoed, again. Picture this. You've got the most distinctive battleship in the Pacific, a ship that cost more than most small countries' annual budgets, equipped with enough firepower to level a city, and you're using her to babysit cargo ships carrying rice and ammunition to far-flung island garrisons. It's like using a Formula One race car as a taxi in downtown traffic. The crew learned that complaining about convoy duty was like complaining about gravity, pointless and exhausting. They'd mastered the art of zigzag patterns, learned to coordinate with destroyer escorts, and developed an almost supernatural ability to spot periscope wakes at impossible distances. Because American submarines were everywhere, like oceanic assassins with an unlimited supply of torpedoes and a personal grudge against anything flying the Japanese flag. The submarine threat had transformed naval warfare in ways that made Fusō's careful modernizations look charmingly obsolete. All that armor plating, all those upgraded fire control systems, all that careful attention to surface gunnery, none of it mattered if a submarine could sneak up and punch a hole in your hull below the waterline. Fusō's anti-submarine defenses were adequate by 1915 standards, improved by 1930 standards, and dangerously insufficient by 1943 standards. Her sonar was better than nothing, her depth charge racks were properly maintained, and her crew was well trained in anti-submarine procedures. But better than nothing wasn't exactly inspiring confidence when you were steaming through waters where entire convoys had disappeared without a trace. The psychological toll was worse than the physical danger. Battles, you can prepare for. Enemy aircraft, you can see coming. But submarines? Submarines were invisible nightmares that could be anywhere, anytime, turning routine convoy duty into a constant state of low-level terror punctuated by moments of absolute panic. Every convoy run became an exercise in controlled paranoia. Lookouts scanning the horizon for periscope feathers. Sonar operators listening for the distinctive sound of approaching torpedoes. Gun crews standing ready to shoot at shadows that might be submarines or might be drifting logs or might be nothing at all. The crew developed the 1,000-yard stare that comes from spending too much time expecting sudden death from invisible enemies. They'd gone from preparing for glorious surface battles to playing a deadly game of hide-and-seek with opponents they couldn't see until it was too late to matter. Operation after operation, convoy after convoy, the same routine. Form up with the merchant ships, establish defensive positions, steam across hundreds of miles of water while pretending that the ocean wasn't full of things trying to kill you. It was warfare reduced to its most basic elements. Survive long enough to deliver the cargo, then do it again tomorrow. The few surface actions that Fusō did participate in were anticlimactic affairs that highlighted just how much the war had changed. Shore bombardment missions where her impressive main guns were used to shell empty beaches and abandoned installations. Fleet actions that consisted of maneuvering around enemy positions that everyone knew were there but nobody could quite locate. It was like being cast as the lead in a play where all the best scenes happened off stage. The crew's morale wasn't helped by the increasingly obvious fact that their ship was being treated as a valuable antique rather than a frontline warship. Newer vessels got the priority assignments, the latest equipment upgrades, and the first pick of replacement personnel. Fusō got whatever was left over and instructions to make do. Making do became the unofficial motto of a crew that had learned to keep a complex, unique, temperamental battleship operational with spare parts scavenged from other ships, jury-rigged repairs, and the kind of creative maintenance that would have made peacetime inspectors weep. By late 1943, everyone understood the reality. They were fighting a war that had passed their ship by. The age of the battleship wasn't ending gracefully, it was being cut short by submarines, aircraft, and new technologies that made their careful gunnery training irrelevant. But they kept doing their job, convoy after convoy, because someone had to, and because running away wasn't really an option when you're on a ship in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. The long middle watch continued, professional and competent and slowly soul-crushing, as Fusō steamed through a war that no longer needed what she had been designed to provide. Chapter 7. Desperation's Last Call. By 1944, the Japanese Navy was learning what it felt like to be a boxer in the 12th round, down on points, bleeding from multiple cuts, and facing an opponent who seemed to get stronger every time you hit him. The early war successes were distant memories. American industrial capacity was hitting its stride, and the writing on the wall was becoming harder to ignore with each passing month. For Fusō, this meant finally getting the call she'd been waiting for her entire career, just not under the circumstances anyone would have wanted. The American advance through the Pacific had reached the point where Japan couldn't afford to keep their older battleships in storage like expensive museum pieces. When your empire is collapsing one island at a time and enemy fleets are steaming toward your homeland, you use every weapon you have, regardless of whether it's theoretically obsolete. The crew could sense the change in the air. After years of convoy duty and defensive patrols, suddenly their ship was being treated as a frontline asset again. Fresh supplies, priority maintenance, and, most tellingly, ammunition loads that suggested someone was expecting them to actually shoot at something important. It was like being benched for 3 seasons and suddenly getting called up to start in the championship game, except the championship game was being played in hell and your team was losing 47-3. The Philippine Sea had turned into an American lake by mid-1944, and the Japanese High Command was facing the kind of strategic crisis that makes reasonable people consider career changes. MacArthur was island hopping his way toward the Philippines, Nimitz was steamrolling through the Central Pacific, and American carrier task forces were operating with the kind of casual confidence that comes from having more ships than your enemy has ports. For Japan, the Philippines represented the last realistic chance to inflict enough damage on the American advance to possibly negotiate some kind of favorable peace. Lose the Philippines, and the war was effectively over except for the dying. Win a decisive victory there, and maybe, just maybe, the Americans might consider terms that didn't involve unconditional surrender. It was desperation masquerading as strategy, but it was all they had left. The plan that emerged from Japanese naval headquarters was ambitious, complex, and riddled with the kind of assumptions that only make sense when all your other options have been eliminated. Multiple fleet units would converge on the Philippines from different directions, catching American forces between them and delivering the kind of devastating blow that would make Pearl Harbor look like a warm-up act. Fusō and her sister ship Yamashiro were assigned to Force C under Vice Admiral Nishimura, a surface action group that would approach through the Surigao Strait and engage American forces in the kind of night surface battle that Japanese crews had trained for their entire careers. Finally, after nearly 3 years of war, Fusō was going to get her chance at a proper battleship engagement. The briefings had an air of forced optimism that fooled absolutely no one. Officers who had spent the war watching their navy shrink with each passing month were suddenly talking about decisive victories and turning the tide of the war. The crew listened with the polite attention of people who knew they were being fed a line but were professional enough to nod along. Everyone understood the reality. This wasn't a carefully planned operation designed to achieve maximum advantage. This was a desperate gamble by a navy that was running out of options, ships, and time. They were being asked to steam into waters controlled by the enemy and somehow achieve what newer, more modern vessels had failed to accomplish. But orders were orders, and honestly, after years of feeling useless, there was something almost liberating about finally being asked to do what they'd been trained for, even if the circumstances were terrible and the odds were worse. The preparation period had a manic intensity that the crew hadn't experienced since the early days of the war. Ammunition loading, equipment checks, emergency repairs that had been deferred for months, suddenly everything was priority one. The ship buzzed with activity as sailors who had spent years performing routine maintenance found themselves preparing for what might be the most important mission of their careers. October 1944 arrived with the kind of tropical weather that would have been perfect for a peacetime cruise and absolutely terrible for what they were about to attempt. Clear skies meant excellent visibility for American aircraft. Calm seas meant American radar would have an easy time tracking surface contacts. Everything about the conditions favored the enemy. The final briefings were studies in controlled desperation. Charts showing American positions, intelligence estimates that everyone knew were optimistic, and tactical plans that assumed everything would go exactly right at precisely the moment when nothing had been going right for months. Nishimura's force was small: 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers against an American fleet that controlled the air, the sea, and probably the weather. It was like bringing a sword to a gunfight, except the other guy also had air support and knew you were coming. As Force C formed up and began steaming toward their destiny, the crew of Fusō finally had what they'd been waiting for: a real mission with real stakes and the genuine possibility of the kind of surface engagement that battleships had been designed for. The irony was thick enough to stop a torpedo. After years of being treated as obsolete, they were finally getting their moment in the spotlight, as part of what was essentially a suicide mission designed by desperate men who had run out of better ideas. But it was their mission, and it was finally time to find out what 30 years of training and 2 major modernizations had actually prepared them for. The distinctive silhouette of Japan's first homegrown battleship cut through Pacific waters one last time, carrying a crew that knew they were steaming toward either redemption or destruction, and possibly both. Chapter 8: The Last Dance. October 25, 1944. 3:16 a.m. Surigao Strait. If you wanted to design the perfect nightmare scenario for a naval force, you'd probably come up with something very much like what Admiral Nishimura was steaming into at 22 knots. A narrow waterway with no room to maneuver, an enemy that knew you were coming, superior numbers waiting in perfect position, and the kind of tactical situation that makes Admiralty textbooks use words like catastrophic and ill-advised. Fusō's crew could feel it in the air, that electric tension that comes when everyone knows something terrible is about to happen but nobody's quite sure what form the disaster will take. They'd been detected hours ago by American PT boats, harassed by destroyer attacks, and were now approaching waters that American radar had been mapping for weeks. This wasn't a battle. This was a mathematical equation disguised as naval combat, and everyone except High Command seemed to understand that the Japanese were working with the wrong numbers. The American battle line was waiting at the far end of Surigao Strait like the world's most expensive firing squad. 6 battleships, Pennsylvania, California, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia, and Mississippi, positioned in a classic crossing the T formation that would have made Nelson weep with joy. Every gun could bear on the approaching Japanese ships, while the Japanese could only fire forward. It was the naval equivalent of walking into a room where everyone's pointing shotguns at the door. At 3:51 a.m., the impossible happened. American destroyers launched a coordinated torpedo attack that was so perfectly executed it looked choreographed. Torpedoes in the water, coming from multiple angles, timed to arrive simultaneously. The kind of textbook attack that naval officers study but rarely see in actual combat. Fusō took 2 torpedo hits almost simultaneously. Picture 30 years of careful engineering, 2 major modernizations, and countless hours of maintenance being undone in approximately 4 seconds. The explosions weren't just damaging the ship, they were rewriting the basic physics of how 30,000 tons of steel and armor held together. The crew felt it immediately, that sickening lurch that means something fundamental has gone very, very wrong with your ship. Emergency lighting flickered on as main power systems failed. Damage control parties rushed toward flooding that was already beyond their capacity to handle. But Fusō kept fighting. This is where her story becomes both heroic and heartbreaking, because what happened next shouldn't have been possible according to any reasonable understanding of naval architecture or human endurance. The torpedo hits had broken her back, literally. The ship was now 2 separate pieces connected by twisted metal and shared momentum, both halves continuing to steam forward into battle like some kind of maritime zombie. The forward section, containing the first 4 gun turrets, kept firing. The rear section, with the last 2 turrets, also kept firing. It was as if someone had cut a battleship in half with a giant saw, and both pieces had decided to continue the fight independently. American radar operators were seeing something that didn't make sense. What had been one large contact was now 2 smaller contacts, both still moving forward, both still shooting. They were witnessing something that had never happened before in naval warfare, a ship that was literally falling apart but refusing to die. The forward section of Fusō, now essentially a floating gun platform with delusions of still being a battleship, engaged American destroyers with her remaining turrets. Her fire control systems, damaged but functional, continued calculating firing solutions for guns that were no longer connected to half the ship they'd been designed to serve. The rear section, meanwhile, was fighting its own separate battle with weapons systems that were trying to coordinate with a bridge that no longer existed. It was like watching someone conduct an orchestra after the concert hall had been demolished around them. 4:08 a.m. American battleships opened fire. 6 of the most powerful warships in the world, positioned perfectly, with radar fire control and unlimited ammunition, began methodically destroying what was left of Nishimura's force. The volume of fire was beyond anything the Japanese had experienced. Shell splashes so dense they created their own weather system. This was what battleship combat looked like when one side had overwhelming advantages and the other side was already broken in half. It wasn't a duel, it was an execution. Both pieces of Fusō kept fighting for another 17 minutes. 17 minutes of continued resistance from a ship that had already suffered what should have been instantly fatal damage. Her crew, trapped in separate sections of a vessel that no longer technically existed as a single entity, continued to man their guns and fire at an enemy that was systematically destroying them. It was either incredibly brave or completely insane. Probably both. 4:19 a.m. The forward section of Fusō finally succumbed to magazine explosions that lit up the strait like a brief, terrible sunrise. The rear section lasted another 9 minutes before following her bow into the deep water of Surigao Strait. In the space of 43 minutes, Japan's first homegrown battleship had been torpedoed, broken in half, shot to pieces, and sent to the bottom along with most of her crew. The ship that had spent 30 years looking for a proper battle had finally found one, and it had gone about as badly as physically possible. The Battle of Surigao Strait was over. American losses, minimal. Japanese losses, essentially everything they'd brought to the fight. Fusō died like almost nothing else ever has, broken in half but still fighting, defiant to the end, victim of her own design flaws and her nation's desperate strategies. She'd finally gotten her moment in the spotlight, and it had lasted exactly as long as it took superior forces to methodically destroy her. The last battleship versus battleship engagement in naval history ended with the complete annihilation of one side by the other. It was a period at the end of the sentence that had been the age of the big gun warship. And somewhere at the bottom of Surigao Strait, in water too deep for salvage, lies the wreck of a ship that spent 3 decades trying to prove herself and finally succeeded in the most tragic way possible. Final chapter. Lessons from the deep. There's something poetic about the fact that Fusō's wreck lies in water too deep for casual exploration. It's fitting, really. She spent her entire existence being just a little too complex, a little too ambitious, and a little too unique for anyone to quite know what to do with her. Modern naval historians have been kinder to Fusō than her contemporaries were. With the benefit of hindsight and computer modeling, we can see that her designers weren't completely insane. They were just trying to solve problems that hadn't been properly defined yet. They wanted the firepower of multiple turrets, the protection of heavy armor, and the speed to keep up with the fleet, all in a single hull that wouldn't bankrupt the nation. The result was a ship that did all of these things adequately and none of them perfectly, which is probably the most honest epitaph any warship has ever earned. Fusō's story is really the story of every ambitious project that gets caught between what's possible and what's practical. She was the naval equivalent of those early experimental aircraft that looked bizarre, flew poorly, but taught engineers everything they needed to know to build the planes that actually worked. Her design flaws weren't character defects, they were learning opportunities that happened to be armed with 14-inch guns and crewed by people who deserved better. Every mistake built into her hull became a lesson for the ships that followed. Every operational difficulty her crew endured became knowledge that made future designs more practical. The Japanese Navy learned from Fusō. The battleships that came after her, Nagato, Yamato, and the rest, were better ships because Fusō had shown them exactly what not to do. Sometimes the most valuable service you can provide is to be the cautionary tale that prevents others from making the same mistakes. But here's the thing about cautionary tales. They usually involve someone paying a price that shouldn't have had to be paid. Fusō spent 30 years being the ship that everyone wished was different, operated by crews who made the best of a situation that was never quite what it should have been. She never got to be the ship she might have been if her designers had been a little less ambitious or a little more experienced. She never got the easy victories that might have justified her unique design. She never even got the peaceful retirement that might have let her serve as a training ship or museum piece. Instead, she got Surigao Strait, where all her design compromises and operational difficulties were exposed in the most unforgiving environment possible. Actual combat against competent enemies who had every conceivable advantage. And yet, and this is important, she fought. Not well, not effectively, not with any realistic chance of success, but she fought. Her crew, faced with impossible odds in a ship that was literally falling apart around them, continued to do their jobs until the ship went down. That's worth remembering, even if everything else about her story serves as an object lesson in how not to design a battleship. Today, naval architects use computer modeling to test designs before they're built. They can simulate thousands of scenarios, identify problems before they become fatal flaws, and optimize systems in ways that Fusō's designers never could have imagined. Modern ships are built with lessons learned from every failure and success that came before, including the hard-won knowledge that came from watching ambitious designs like Fusō struggle with problems that could have been avoided with better planning. She earned her place in naval history not by being great, but by being instructive. Not by succeeding, but by showing others how to succeed. Sometimes that's the most important service you can provide, being the example that teaches everyone else to do better. The water above Fusō's wreck is deep and dark, but the lessons from her story continue to surface whenever someone sits down to design something ambitious, complex, and just a little too clever for its own good. She was Japan's first homegrown battleship, her designer's noble failure, her crew's daily challenge, and naval history's most educational disaster. Not a bad legacy for a ship that never quite worked the way it was supposed to. I hope you found this video valuable. If it was helpful, please like and share it with someone who could benefit. Subscribe for more content like this. And if you want to support the channel while getting exclusive perks, consider becoming a channel member. Your support means everything to me. Until next time, take care.